Well, thank you for allowing me to talk today. I wanted to talk about what's going on in Argentina in the framework of the crisis that whole of Latin America is suffering nowadays with COVID, but that comes from a few years back, almost a decade of crisis we have been suffering. It's important to understand that before the COVID came about, there were many struggles in Latin America and South America in particular. You should remember the students and the youth in Chile struggling in 2019 for a reduction in the price of the subway. It wasn't just about that. It was more about the effects of what was left by the dictatorship. We also can also remember the people in Ecuador struggling against the adjustment program of the IMF, also in 2019, and in many other countries in the region. We have to understand that all of this was in the midst of the crisis of what were called the progressive and popular governments, and in the middle of a round of right-wing neoliberal governments in Brazil, of course in Ecuador, then the coup in Bolivia, etc. Well, the governments in Chile and other countries in the Andes. And during the COVID, much of the actual conflict, the open conflict, went underground, but it is currently re-emerging. And after this neoliberal impasse, we are seeing a new turn away from neoliberal right-wing governments. We have in Chile the movement for a new constitution. In Ecuador and Peru, there is a crisis of both neoliberal governments. Lula has been set free recently in Brazil, with all the critiques that one can make to the PT government. And we also have in Mexico and also in Argentina, some what they call new progressive governments, which in my mind are more likely to be called conservative developmentalist governments. I'm not sure if they are progressive in any sense, in any real sense. In late 2019, Alberto Fernandez was elected president in Argentina after 4 years of a neoliberal government of Mauricio Macri. And since then, many social movements that were in the streets fighting against Macri have been removed from the streets and got into government. There are several places in government that have been given to small peasant organizations, to piquetero movements. We had the creation of the Ministry of Women and Diversities, and we also had the approval of abortion in Argentina last year. But this is important because we have to say that the struggles on the streets from previous years eventually paid off in the sense that there were changes in state, in policies, so that struggles on the streets can help the population win rights. But it is also true that it is difficult to see radical transformations coming just from occupying spaces on the state. And this is something that we, social organizations in Argentina, are discussing a lot during these past few years. During the COVID crisis, during the whole of last year, many grassroots organizations were fundamental for example, for the reproduction of life in popular neighborhoods, while at the same time, the state didn't help very much except by sending the police to these popular neighborhoods, right, to control the populations. So even though there were some small emergency subsidies given by the government, the ingreso familiar de emergencia, for example, in Argentina, a very small amount of money that has already been eliminated, even though unemployment and wages, or unemployment is still very high, and wages have been lowered during last year and haven't gone up again. This means to me that while this government, the Alberto Fernandez government feels progressive, they call themselves progressive, they are not essentially left-wing governments. They are renegotiating the external debt to keep paying it, and now they are looking for a new agreement with the IMF. Wages and pensions are moving below inflation rates. Extractivism is still strong with policies by the state to multiply mining, to promote nuclear energy, nuclear power plants. In the last few weeks, we've had several non-accidental fires in forests in several places that open the place for social production, new private urbanizations, etc. There's much talk about what we can call green capitalism, but not a radical change in the effects of capitalism on nature. There's also some repression of popular movements. For example, last year in the middle of the pandemic, one huge popular settlement of about 3,000 homeless families was repressed. People who were expelled from vacant lands that they were using to build their homes. They didn't have their property rights, but they needed the place. They were expelled by the police. So there's still a lot of judicialization of protest and of poverty. And in this context, this is the main problem I would like to put forth for discussion. I don't have an answer. We don't have an answer. We are having lots of difficulties for articulation of popular movements because there are many movements that prefer to work with the government instead of struggling on the streets right now. Because they say that if you struggle on the streets against a progressive government, you may help the right-wing government to come back. They say no hay que hacerle el juego a la derecha. You don't have to play with the right. And well, this difficults the politics in general. But in any case, women and feminists are still on the streets, and the piquetero movement is also back on the streets today. Right now, there's a very important mobilization in the main city, in the capital city of Argentina, of the piquetero movement. And there are lots of struggles against extractivism all over the country. So there is like a struggle with the state and against the state to define how we can move for a more radical social change. And this is the question I'd like to ask. See if the incorporation of our demands into state institutions, for example, the Ministry of Women, can diffuse the radicality of the social movements and its demands, which is something that is problematic. And in that sense, how can we, in this context of progressive governments, build new collective practices that go beyond the states, that are not limited by state policies and politics? That's about it. That's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariano. That was great. We've heard now from 3 different contexts: Peru, Brazil, Argentina, but many of the references to other places. We're going to go to breakout rooms, but let me just make just a quick reaction, not necessarily for you to answer, but at this point, but something to bear in mind. It's really related to COVID. Has the COVID made things worse? In the sense that there are limits imposed on us actually getting together in the streets. We've seen this here in London. I know you're not in London right now, but just 2 days ago, when there was a movement of women and others protesting the death of a woman here in the London streets, and very heavily suppressed by the police. And my observation also is under COVID, there's been a lot of action being taken by the private sector and by governments to move forward in extractive type industries. We heard about that in our very first seminar a couple of weeks back. And it does seem to be the case that human rights defenders and environmental defenders are facing much graver difficulties now than a couple of years back. In other words, it's got much more difficult to defend human rights, much more violence against human rights, so on. I don't say this necessarily to provoke a question now, but if to take us into the next section, which is going to be the breakout, seeing that we might need to see a little bit the context of the last 12 months.